3, 2, 1. Don't say anything you don't want anybody to know outside this room.
I still have a hard time remembering names, but I know faces.
When you say that, our ears perk up.
Yeah.
Like, don't say anything. I brought you.
Oh,
I brought
Two
you some
more.
treats.
Did you get one? Oh, you
I
did.
brought you some treats. Mommy got you some treats.
She is so beautiful. I wish my puppy would act like that. No, she's going to bite
See, I
you
take after my
and jump
mommy.
on
all
you.
right. Let's see. That's
She's not,
too
she's not a
many.
big dog, but still.
You take after
All
mommy.
right, there we go.
She's so chill. Star in her cheek.
All right,
She's
we're
worse than
we're up and going. So
Star.
I thought Patsy was coming in.
She is.
She went to the next
She's
door.
gossiping.
Okay.
Oh, that's not good.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Fellowshipping.
That's right.
You have been a Baptist too long.
Discussing community activities.
Okay, well, let's.
Well, you gotta put it on the screen now. You ain't got it hooked up.
It's not doing.
No, it says no signal.
No signal HDMI 3. Are you on
Is it
HDMI
Oh,
3?
wait, I
or
haven't
should
done
it be
it
HDMI 1 or
Hold
what?
on, hold on, hold
Oh, there
on.
it is.
That help.
Now we cook one.
There's the one we need.
Yeah.
There we go. Oops.
Give it a second.
There
There
we
we
go.
go.
All right. Okay, so we let's go ahead. If you can get the door shut, we can deal with that.
Sit up here, be a front row back to somebody. 'Cause
Okay.
Madison can sit right there.
All right. So the last chapter of Micah is a chapter of judgment and hope. So we talked about when we started how the prophets kind of put us in this back and forth motion of condemnation and hope, salvation, passages about the Messiah, passages about the oppressors, and it's meant when the people would hear, and it was meant to kind of shake them loose from their complacency toward God. And of course, we know how complacent they had become. They had filled their lives with every kind of idol. They were treating their own people terribly. There was no sense of justice at all. There was certainly no compassion offered to the poor. And so we see this yet one more time in this final chapter. And then we will get to the message of hope that kind of ends the book. It's not uncommon for the prophets to just, they get to the end and it's the end. There's always a beginning, but not always an ending. It stops and it stops, and so they're left. Part of that is intentional. It leaves you kind of on the edge of your seat. What is going to be the next thing? Is it going to be an offering of hope and salvation, or is God going to finally carry out what He's been talking about doing? And that in itself is to elicit a response, a positive response from the people. Now we know from history that there wasn't a positive response. Everything that happened that God told them, even as far back as Abraham, and certainly when they were coming out of Egypt, and then several times since through the prophets, everything was going to happen the way that God said. Not that He was preordaining it to happen, but He knew His creation. And He knew the sinfulness and the brokenness and the hopelessness that would utterly drape a cloud on everything that God had planned for His people. So, in the end of chapter 6, it was God speaking. Now, we're back to Micah speaking. So he says, "How sad for me," or "Woe is me," or "This is a terrible state of affairs that we're in." It's almost like the hopelessness that we find in Ecclesiastes, and that was written by Solomon so many hundreds of years before. He's hopeless about the prospect of life because he simply can't make sense of it. Micah is hopeless about the prospects of life, and he is making perfect sense of it. Okay, things are not going the way that God wanted them, and that's the mess that they're in. He says, "For I am like one who," and then there's this line that it's kind of an interjection here. "When the summer fruit has been gathered, after the gleaning of the grapes, finds no grape or clusters to eat, no early fig, which I crave." Okay, so you remember the rule that was set forth by Moses when you plant your fields? You don't harvest everything in your field. You leave the edges, okay? And that was for the poor to come along, and they were to have that because they didn't have land or they didn't have a good crop or whatever it was. You left some, and that was an illustration by God to be able to say, brother looking out for brother. There was not a need to hand out help to your brother. You could allow them the dignity of taking care of themselves.
Right.
Okay? And all of this established a sense of justice and mercy in the land. There was no need to take all of it. It was merciful, and there was no need to expect a handout. You could go and get what you needed to live. Now, what he's saying here is two things. One is that by this time, Israel is the vine illustrates the life of Israel. And we'll find later, in just a few years after this, that Isaiah speaks beautifully of the nation being a vine and God cultivating his vine, but it not producing anything. Well, here we are, is the foreshadowing of that. All the good has left the nation. He says, I go and I'm looking for what should be there to provide mercy and sustenance and hope and life, and it's just not there anymore. Okay, so that's what he means by the gleaning of the grape harvest, finding no grapes. And then he says no early figs. Now, you remember Jesus when he curses the fig tree? And in Mark, I think it's in Mark, it has a parallel in one of the others, I think Luke. But he goes and Jesus says he goes to this fig tree, and there's no figs on the fig tree. And Mark makes a point of letting us know because it's not the season for figs. So why would there be figs on the fig tree? Okay, so that leaves a big question in our head. Why would Jesus curse a tree for something that it really should not have had to begin with? Well, when we look at this passage, it talks about early figs. And this could be the same time of year. We don't know exactly what he was referring to. But the early fig there was this time, and it's not true for our figs, it's true for the Middle Eastern fig. You can go there today and this happens. You trim the branches so you can have new branches. Well, the old branch that was left for the new branch would ripen a fig before the new branches would. That was called the early fig. Okay? And so he's saying there was no early figs. They would appear not as big as a regular fig, but very, very sweet. So when Jesus goes to the fig tree and he curses it because there are no figs, it was the early fig that he's looking for, and this tree that he had went to for figs wasn't going to ever produce. Because if it wasn't going to produce early figs, it was not going to produce the late ones either. And so Jesus curses it, but it becomes an illustration that there's not a good priest and there's not a good temple leader left in all of Jerusalem and Judea and Galilee. There's none left. And so that vine is gone, that tree is gone, and there's the new tree, the tree that's sprouted up out of the root of Jesse. Okay, so one's gone and he's the new tree. Here it's the same thing. There's nothing left good in the country because it's been ravished. First of all, those that are the leaders, those that are quite rich, have taken advantage of really the good, the remnant, and so there's nothing left. So that kind of ties, it does kind of tie into that episode with Jesus and lets us kind of see that it's a great illustration that has been used for a very, very long time in Scripture. And then he, verse 2 kind of gives definition to verse 1. Faithful people have vanished from the land. That word faithful people is the Hesed people. So that's the word that's used here for faithful. It's the root word. It's also the root word that God uses for everlasting love or loyal love. So what he's saying here, the people that were of loyal love to Yahweh are gone. They vanished from the land. There's not one upright among the people. Nobody left. All of them wait. Now this is the leaders that have picked the country dry or bare. I sound like Yogi Berra there for a minute. I gotta scroll this up a little bit. It says, all of them wait in ambush and in bloodshed. So this is a description of what has been happening. Those that have misused the people, they've done it very intentionally. They've set traps. They've laid in wait to ambush and to take advantage of the people. All right, it's total injustice. So when we read Micah and Amos, when we're going to start later on tonight, when we look at portions of Isaiah, not Hosea as much, but some, Hosea is more concerned about the fidelity of the people. These two books, Amos and Micah, are more concerned about the injustice that is performed first against God in idol worship and second against the people in the way that they're mistreated and they're treated so unjustly. So he says, both hands are good for accomplishing evil, means everything that they do is about evil. The official and the judge demand a bribe. All right, so what's it saying?
They're all crooked.
That's right.
Yeah.
Your laws
Everybody.
Yeah,
Everybody's compromised.
that's right. The very systems that are set up to make sure that things are run fair, it's corrupted with money, greed. Same thing that's happening today. Hasn't changed a bit.
Yeah, it's like
Yeah.
today. Yeah.
Not going to help the poor kids in schools.
Both hands are good at accomplishing evil. The official and the judge demand a bribe. When the powerful man communicates his evil desire, they plot it out together. So they get together, smoke-filled rooms, back rooms, and they say, "This is how we're going to do things, and we're going to be better off for it." And so what if?
It oppresses the people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The best of them is like a briar. The most upright is worse than hedge thorns. So what this is, briars form a hedge that says you can't come through. So they were the gatekeepers of life, and justice was bound up, shut out. The day of your watchman, the day of your punishment is coming. At this time, their panic is here. So the day of the watchman, the prophets were the watchmen. They were the ones that were declaring exactly what God had in store. And he's saying that everything that the prophets have been telling you, it's here. Okay? Your punishment is coming. And at this time, their panic is here. It's kind of a different... what he's saying, everything that is the way that you respond to what God is about to do, all your conniving, all your wealth, all of that's going to be wrapped up in panic. You're not going to know what to do.
It's going to be confusion.
It's going to be confusion. It's going to be let's see. It's going to be the kind of life that you thought you were planning a life for yourself through your conniving and evilness, but what's actually happening is you're going to be thrown into a panic. Now, verse 5 is really, it's kind of the centerpiece of this, because it's speaking of the relationships that we have. everything that God desired and accomplished through the law and with His people happened in a proper relationship with Him and a proper relationship with those who were the elders over them. The way that they treated one another in the tribes and among the tribes, all of this relied on a level of understanding that says, I'm going to care for you more than I do myself. And if we accomplish this, it's going to be good. But the minute that that there's a wedge of distrust that comes in, then all these other things are able to happen freely. Okay? And so now he gets to that and he says, do not rely on a friend. So here you are at this point in life when God's about to bring forth everything that He's promised. And He said, you are not going to be able to rely on anybody.
Because Christians were compromised too.
Mhm.
Then,
Yeah.
too.
The who was?
The people,
Christians.
God's people.
Oh, yeah.
They were probably giving in, and so who can you trust when you can't even trust?
That's right.
Somebody who says they love God and their servant.
That's
And
exact.
That's
That's
in a nutshell. That's what he's saying. Don't trust nobody.
that's right.
Put no confidence in your friend.
Because people look at themselves first instead of
Yeah.
Right, their own needs, their own stuff first. And that's exactly where we are today.
Now that's like when somebody comes to tell you something, he's saying, don't believe it.
Yeah.
That you cannot rely on that person for anything. Even their word is compromised. And then he says, don't trust in a close companion, which really, that line has everything to do with you won't even be able to trust your own husband or wife. Okay? So your closest relationships have been corrupted through all of this. So that you live in a world of suspicion, not peace. So when God says that I've come to provide you peace, there's going to be peace on every side. There's going to be rest on every side. Because I'm here. This is now the final the final end to God not being present, is that there's just this overwhelming sense of suspicion.
Cannot let it go.
Yeah, well, where do you go to? I mean, when you can't trust anybody, where do you go?
God, only place.
But if you're worshiping idols and God's not in the picture, all you have is yourself,
That's right.
and that's the worst thing in the world. You know. So he says, seal your mouth from the woman who lies in your arms. So he just says it another way. You're there with your wife, your most intimate, closest person in the world to you, and you don't want to tell her anything. She's liable to use it against you. So this is the level of deception and distrust that has come upon the people. Surely his son considers his father a fool. A daughter opposes her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies are the men of his own household. So you don't have family anymore. The son is not honoring the father, and the daughter is not honoring the mother. So
Is this present day for them, or is this prophetic for us?
I think it's
A little both.
I think
I think it's a little both.
I think it's here. It was for them for sure. But I think we do the same things today. But I mean, we just look at the level of distrust that exists in our country. When I heard this today. I don't know if y'all heard a current event from yesterday and today. I don't know if you heard what Matthew McConaughey had to say about the whole Uvalde thing.
That was his hometown.
But But I heard a person say today that you can believe what he says, okay, because he says it with such conviction,
Yeah.
which is probably true. I don't think the guy was play acting.
What
No,
did
he
he
wasn't
say?
But- But this is the point I want to make is you can trust what he says because he's convicted about what he believes. He believes what he says.
Mm-hmm.
But today you're not sure if anybody actually believes what they say. Is it motivated for other reasons? And we get that at a higher level, but then we begin. We want to label everybody, and
Yeah,
so that we can kind of box them up, so that we want to know if we can trust them or not.
Yeah, they labeled him as a Hollywood,
Yeah, well, some did. I think he did a great job, but that boxing people up and say you're this or you're that,
Yeah.
that allows for you to not have a relationship with that person. You just have to have a relationship with the label. And that creates suspicion, because I'm not a label, they're not a label.
Right.
And this was some of that was going on here. You just it was easier to just discount people. And once you start discounting people, well, pretty soon life doesn't mean much of anything.
Yeah.
And we've experienced that in our culture too. So the father's disrespected, the mother's disrespected, the family that has come together through the bonds of a marriage, that's been destroyed. And a man's household, meaning his servants, his sons, his family, he can't trust them either. So this is just an expansion of this idea that he's begun speaking to in verse 3. So he says in verse 7, I'm sorry I keep messing
You
with this
want me to
thing.
get you some water, Brother Mark?
You know, that would be all right.
All
Now, oh, that's good, thank you. Now we get Zion. This is Zion's vindication. The city itself, God has said, is going to be vindicated. But we still have Micah speaking. So he says, do not rejoice over me, or this is actually Micah speaking, but it's Jerusalem speaking. Do not rejoice over me, my enemy. And there were many. We're about to find out in Amos there was at least 6 different nations that were giving them trouble at this particular time. Though I have fallen, I will stand up. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light. Because I have sinned against him, I must endure the Lord's fury. So what is he... What's he saying here? I've sinned. I got to own my sin,
Yep.
and I got to own what God's going to do about my sin. So there's consequences, and the best way, the shortcut back to God, is to accept the consequences. The more that, confess them. Stop rationalizing. Stop pretending they're not there. Just go ahead and admit the sinfulness that's there. And God already has a loving response.
Yep.
Doesn't mean it's not painful, but it's always a loving response. It moves us from the place of our sin to the place of being right with him. And you can imagine that would be a painful journey. If Jesus became sin so that we could become the righteousness of God, that was a painful journey. But it was one of love, and at the end, more was achieved than what could ever have been lost, and that was his life. This is an amazing thing to think about. So this is what he's saying to us. I must endure the Lord's fury until he champions my cause. So what cause? Good question. What would be the cause?
To bring them back to him.
Yes, in this particular context, it's justice. He is going to champion my cause, my life. He's going to bring justice back to my life. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. And my Bible says it'll bring me out into the light. I will see his righteousness.
The light is a good. That's a good translation because that actually does have a root word that says my cause is to be his light.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is significant because as far back as Abraham, God said, "You will be a light unto who? The nations." All right. So it's a renewal of purpose. It's a renewal of identity. It says, He will bring me into the light, and I will see His salvation. God is going to deal with my sin, and as a result of that, I'm going to know Him for what He is about, and that is my salvation. Meaning what? He's never quit on His promise.
That's right.
Not even once. And we keep talking about that and thinking, well, you keep making that point, Mark, but God keeps making that point in Scripture because it would have been easy to come to believe that we have sunk so low that there's no way God's going to keep his promise to us.
Well, I heard because we as people, if we were God, we would have done give up on us. You know what I'm saying? But God is greater than that. He still hasn't given up on us.
That's right.
You know what I'm saying? And so that's a really important thing.
Yeah.
One of the things I tell Madison every morning is when I tell her, I said, make sure let the Lord's light shine through you today. Don't I tell you
Calls
that?
me every day to tell me that.
Yeah. And so I just think that we still need to do that, you know. no matter
Absolutely.
what, you know, because
Yeah, he does tell me that. Every day.
Now there's the theme of light that we'll come across again.
Mm-hmm.
There's the theme of a harvest. That's the same thing. Water, springs, all those illustrations help us understand that God has restored us. That life is there in some particular way that we recognize that wasn't there before, that has come to us from God. Then in verse 10 it says, then my enemy will see, and she will be covered with shame. They're going to see, what are they going to witness? God's providence and restoration. And their shame is going to be not only that God has cared for his daughter Zion, but that they've been worshiping the wrong God.
Yeah.
And we're still in that, this is a constant underlying theme that's going on in all these prophet books, these prophetic books, is that there's really the struggle between God and all the other false gods, and they exist everywhere. And we're always drawn to the attention that those that have made the mistake of sticking with the false gods are ultimately brought to shame. But he never has turned his back on Zion, the city, or the people. Of course, we have to understand what that means, because they did go into exile for 75 years and remain there another 100 and some odd years before there was a final movement, but there wasn't any after that, after about 100 and something years. So he says, they will put me to shame. He says, she will be...
Can I ask you a question? Where it keeps saying she, you know, is that? I read something one time like it's like comparing to Eve.
That's a stretch.
Is it?
Yeah. Well, because you got to have an
That's
Adam
why I
to compare
wasn't
it to Eve.
sure. That's why I'm.
Yeah. What it is they looked at Jerusalem as, they called her the daughter.
Oh yeah, that's what.
Okay, so that's where the she comes from. It's the daughter, and it's God's daughter. It's the one that he's has. That what will he do? He's going to betroth his daughter to who? At the end, it's to his son Jesus. And so there's you can't get past the fact that the church is the new Israel, because not only did Jesus make it pretty clear, everything before and everything after did too. So that preparation for marriage is all through the Old Testament, and then declared as the culmination of what God's going to do with the new heaven and new earth. Yeah. So then my enemy will see, and she will be covered with shame. The one who said to me, "Where is the Lord your God?" You know, that was what Nebuchadnezzar told him when he went into town. All right, where is this God that y'all talk about so much? And he went in and tore down a temple and took all the gold off the walls and off the columns, and just basically raped the place, and knocked a big old hole in the side of the temple to carry the stuff out. So this is Micah repeating that, but he says, "My eyes will look at her triumph," meaning that Nebuchadnezzar's comments are not gonna last. I'm gonna see her rise again. At that time, she will be trampled like mud in the streets. So he's Wait a minute. I don't want to. Yes, sir.
Where's the restroom?
Restroom?
Right.
Right there to the
First
right.
door to the right, then to the right again.
Pass the table to the right.
I mean-
Right against all of
Uh-oh. I gotta find this note because I don't want to mess it up. So let's see, in 9b, Zion confidently anticipates gazing on God's salvation. In 10b, Zion confidently predicts the enemy's abject humiliation. So the she at the end of the verse is her enemies. Now the pronouns really get messed up sometimes in this, and it is hard to understand. Some modern translations help us. This one doesn't. They stick more to the literal vocabulary word. But it's the structure of the sentence, the noun and verb agreement, that allows us to know that it's talking about not at Jerusalem, but another. It's just that the English doesn't bring that forward. And that's why it sounds like, oh, well, now she's talking about being trampled like mud in the streets, but it's actually the enemies. A day will come for rebuilding your walls. Okay, that day's very far off. That's when Ezra returns. On that day, your boundary will be extended. On that day, people will come to you from Assyria and the cities of Egypt, even from Egypt to the Euphrates River, from sea to sea and mountain to mountain. On that day, that's kind of the same thing he talked about in chapter 4. People are going to flood here because this is going to be the place to be. And of course, in chapter 4, he goes on to explain because God's there. God's going to be honored there. His people are there. They're bringing the nations, doing exactly what God had intended for this time to be, but it had been corrupted. Then the earth will become a wasteland because of its inhabitants and as a result of their actions, meaning that there will be no need for anywhere else. Israel will be the center of everything. Not that God's going to destroy it, but it will all be abandoned because they're going to want to be with God. So, let's see, this is a famous passage. It's quoted a lot. Shepherd your people with your staff, the flock that is your possession. They live alone in the woodlands, surrounded by pastures. Let them graze in Bashan and Gilead as in ancient times. So this is a prayer to God saying, come and shepherd your people. Okay? With your staff. So in the 23rd Psalm, David refers to your rod and your staff will comfort me. Okay? A staff was used to direct. Okay? Usually the rod and the staff were the same thing, but the rod end had a knot on the end of it, and it was used punitively against the sheep. You would hit them, okay, to get them to do what you needed to do. But the staff end, okay, it had the hook, or it had a hook place in it, and it was used more to guide. So he's saying to shepherd your people with your staff. We've been through enough. We've learned our lesson. You don't need to use a rod. He says, shepherd the flock with your staff, the flock that is your possession. They live alone in the woodland. Sheep weren't made to live up in the woods, but that's where they would run to for protection and hide when things were bad. So he's saying that time's over, and God's going to come back and bring his people into pasture, into where they should be, you know. And when we look at Ezekiel's passage about the shepherd that comes and leads his people, and John 10, when the shepherd comes, Jesus referring to himself as the good shepherd, it all relates to this same kind of passage where he's coming to bring us into pasture. And if you were in the pasture, you had someone watching to make sure you were safe so that you could feast. That's what it was about. You brought sheep into a pasture so they could get fat. That was the idea. But you had to have somebody there to watch them, because if you didn't, the wolves were going to come and get them. So Jesus is our our shepherd, not only in the way that he guides us, but he's protecting us.
We've used the analogy before of getting ourselves in the briars.
Yeah,
Out of the pasture and into
Into
the
the-
briars. And he
yeah, pulls us back out of there.
Mhm.
Yeah, and never quits. We can resist that, and but he never quits. He keeps up till he has us right where he wants us. Okay, Bashan and Gilead were cities that were listed in Joshua, so they've been around a long time, and it's been a part of the agricultural history of the Northern Kingdom. And so he's saying those were the good old days when we were able to just enjoy the fruit of your hand that you had given us. Then he says, I will perform, this is God speaking now. They prayed for these things. Now God is telling them what he's going to do. I will perform miracles for them as in the days of your exodus from the land of Egypt. So here we go again. That is the epicenter of everything that happened for these people was coming out of Egypt. It is salvation. And every writer, nearly every one of the prophetic writings brings us back to that memory. What happened in Egypt. Nations will see and be ashamed of all their power. Why? Because God went up against the gods of Egypt and wiped them out. Okay? So no nation would ever stand proud before God. They can only stand in shame. They will put their hands over their mouths and their ears will become deaf. So they're not going to say anything. They don't want to hear anything. Leave us alone. Kind of like Pharaoh did, right? Mm-hmm. After his son died, just get out of here. Yeah. And, changed his mind 2.5 days later. Said, yeah. He says, they will lick the dust like a snake. Absolutely referring back to creation. These are evil nations, and they're going to slither around and eat the dust like the serpent of old. They will come trembling out of their hiding places like reptiles slithering on the ground. They will tremble in the presence of the Lord our God. They will stand in awe of you. Okay, so this is what is anticipated and promised. So ultimately, from our perspective, we're looking at the defeat of what is evil. It's going to be gone. It's going to stand in awe. And so John in his Revelation reminds us everyone is going to bow. Everyone's going to be in awe of God and Christ. There's no escaping it. And those ultimately that are evil, they're going to be cast into a place where there is no sense of life at all. It's death, period. Pure and simple. So, then he goes on. Who is a God like you? This is, you've heard this. There's a song written, a contemporary song written around this passage. But who is a God like you, he's saying, forgiving iniquity and passing over rebellion for the remnant of his inheritance. Now, we're going to look at all the other gods. And so at this time, there's at least 10 or 12 in the neighborhood that were being worshipped by either other nations or in Judah and Israel. Okay, and so his question is, okay, let's look at all these other gods. Are any of them like you? Do any of them forgive? No.
Micah saying this?
Yeah. Yeah. Do any of them forgive when their people fail them? No. Their whole religious construct is built on if you fail your God, you're going to be punished. You may even die. You may have to sacrifice your firstborn child in order to appease. Okay, so they're saying, but is there any gods like you who forgive our iniquity or our sin? Who passes over our rebellion? Now we know God doesn't turn a blind eye to rebellion, but he doesn't treat it the way he ought. We have the oughtness of our faith that says we ought to behave a certain way before God because of what he's done and who he is. Okay, but God doesn't have to do. There's no oughtness about God. When he looks past our rebellion, it is because he's already made arrangement for it. It doesn't go unchecked. He deals with it in whatever way that he's going to deal with it. Ultimately, for this generation, it was exile. But for our generation, he deals with our rebellion on the cross. He deals with everything on the cross. He goes on to say, he does not hold his anger forever. With these other gods, anger became the personality of the god. You offended the god, and you were forever in danger of his anger striking out. So you were constantly not appeasing a God out of love, you were appeasing a God out of fear. But here we have this God who doesn't hold on to his anger forever, meaning that it's going to pass like a vapor almost. We have the opportunity to relate to God in the way that he desires, and that is in love. Because there's no reason not to. His anger's gone. Because he delights in hesed, mercy, faithful love. He will again have compassion on us. He will vanquish our iniquities. He will cast out our sins into the depth. He will cast all our sins into the depth of the sea. All right, so sins in the depth of the sea, important because the sea was the place of evil and suffering. What was lost at sea was lost, and it never came back. And so they had this real fear, and well, not fear so much, but that in the sea things were bad. Storms came up in the sea, wreck a ship, take out everybody on it, never see them again. It was, yeah. It became a vision of what was evil. That was the source of evil. I think we talked about this in well, anyway. John says in Revelation 21 that the new heaven and the new earth come down, and there's no sea in the new earth, and that's because there's no evil, and that was the source of evil. So you don't have to worry about any evil appearing in the new earth because there's no sea, meaning there's no source of evil. So that's what he's saying here. All of this is cast into the place where it should be. He says, you will show your loyalty to Jacob and faithful love, hesed again, to Abraham, as you swore to your ancestors from days long ago. And that's the end. So that's kind of like the benediction to the whole book. So he says, you're loyal, you show your loyalty to Jacob and your faithful love. So the way that the construct is in the language, loyalty and faithful love refer to both of Jacob and Abraham. So it's the completeness of God. He's loyal, and he's loyal in his love, and there's nothing that can be done about that because he's sworn an oath about it.
Keeps his covenant even if we don't.
Yeah, knowing that we won't. Most importantly, he goes into this whole thing knowing that we're going to not be able to keep it. But it's important for our relationship with God that we know that he has made the covenant with us and that he is always going to keep it. So now we have a firm foundation that we stand on in that, knowing that when we fail, it's always going to be there. And now we are left to determine what loyal love means for us toward God. And he leaves that for us to determine. Am I going to be loyal? Am I going to have loyal love for God who's done so much for me? And some are successful in living that life, and then others are in constant turmoil in their life because they just can't quite find the loyal part of that love. Of course I love God. Well, how loyal are you in it? That's the rest of the definition. I don't think anybody would say, any Christian would say that, yeah, I love him. I love God. But how loyal? And that's an important concept.
Kind of like love is not what you say, but what you do.
Yes.
The way you live. That's what I'm saying it is.
Yeah, because and love is a verb anyhow. And so we can't get away from that whole concept either. That we think of love as something that we have, and there's not even a way really to do that in the Bible. It's never used in a noun form so much as it is that when it's spoken of, or when we translate it as a noun, we do it out of our English point of view. But what it really saying is that if I have love, it means that I'm acting in it. And we sometimes say we have love, and we choose not to act in it. So when you say you love a ham sandwich, you really can't act in that love toward that ham sandwich. You really can't. So we do that all the time. But for the Greek, it would say, well, how are you going to do that? You can't do that because you can't act out that to a ham sandwich. But you can act out your love generally to something that can return that love. But then agape comes along and says you act out love, never expecting any love back. That's the purest way to deal with love. All right, y'all. There's a couple of handout sheets here. I only made 8. I don't know if I had enough. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I ought to have enough.
There's one
Where are
right
they?
there that nobody's using.
Give it mine away.
Oh, that's yours. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, my friend.
Well, I want us to take a look at it.
You want one, baby? Oh, yes, sir.
I will spend. You want to go? You want to? That's all right. I'd have to reset for some reason it won't go.
I'll give her.
Okay.
I'm good. I can take it.
So we're going to start with Amos. Amos was he was the reluctant prophet. He wasn't called to be a prophet. Neither was Micah, for that matter. But the others that we come across, more than likely, were part of prophetic guilds. Now, what is that? We're going to talk about that a little bit. There were prophets in the land, and there were those that were respected because of the way that they spoke the words of God. Thus saith the Lord. And really the common everyday people had a better understanding of what the prophets were offering than those that were in charge. That's usually the case, how it goes. The people that are in charge, they want to be in charge. A prophet would remind them that God's in charge. And this is what he's telling me to tell you. Well, the common people had a greater sense of what that meant because they were usually on the receiving end of what was being done unjustly or unfairly. Or they were able to just observe and see that, no, this is not what the God of our ancestors had in mind. They had enough of a tradition of the law where they could understand. Or if they didn't have it, they were hungry for it. So they would have these, if you recognize that someone was a prophet, then you would ask to be a part of their life. Can I learn from you? Can I be with you? You wanted to have, it was considered that you could receive from that person the same kind of prophetic gift. And so we see that in Elijah and Elisha. God tells him to choose Elisha. He goes and he chooses him, and we know the rest of the story. So the same thing was expected to happen in these instances, but that wasn't the case for Amos. He was called out of his profession, which he was a herdsman and maybe a specialist in husbandry of some kind at that time. But we also find out later in the book that he trimmed sycamore trees, and sycamore trees were down in the plain area, less than sycamores in that part of the world don't grow above 1,000 feet. So, and where he's from, Tekoa, is up in the hills, several miles away. And so we find out that Amos is moving around a lot. He's kind of got 2 jobs, and he has to go to different areas of the country to do it. So he's moving back and forth. Tekoa's in the southern kingdom, but where the sycamore trees are in the northern kingdom. So he's moving around and he's getting an idea of everything that's happening. All right, and then he's called into this prophetic work. Not that he was looking for it, but God gave it to him, and he's quite brilliant in the way that he writes. What we have here, this whole letter, this whole work, is really a trial document. So he's kind of in court, and he's making a statement about how the covenant with God has been offended, and what God is about to do about it. And he lays it out in those ways, in what you would kind of hear in a court argument. And he does this in the part we'll look at tonight, he does for 6 nations, and then Judah and Israel. And then, well, you can look at your outline there. So it breaks down into 1, 2, 3 sections. The first is a judgment against the various nations, including Judah and Israel. And then there's the pronouncement of judgment. He lays out the lawsuit. The covenant, he lays out the covenant lawsuit the first time, the covenant lawsuit the second time. All right, you'll see the difference here. He speaks of the information for, and then he indicts all that's wrong, the social sin, religious sin, in section B there under 2, and then C, the covenant lawsuit again, describes in a lament form everything that has happened, and he's lamenting what has happened. And then finally in D, pronounces judgment over all of it. And then the last part is section 3, and it talks about the prophetic visions of judgment, judgment turned aside, judgment not turned aside, and then finally the restoration and blessing. So we're going to follow this as we move through. We'll probably be through with Amos. We'll take 2 full weeks and probably be done with all 9 chapters, because a lot of it repeats the same language. It's just applied to a different subject. It's just addressing a different nation or a different person or a different problem, but it's all nearly the same. So that's that. The other thing that it does is that we find correlation between what he is saying and how that relates back to the law. Okay? So on this, we're not going to look at all this tonight, but these final 2 sheets here, it shows in the left-hand column, it shows the passage in Amos. Then it shows the phrase or concept in the middle column. And then it also relates that phrase or concept back to the Pentateuch, which is the 5 books, the first 5 books of the Bible. And so what this helps us understand is that Amos is arguing for the defense of everything that God established after he brought his people into freedom and the law and how they were supposed to live. So he points out their failures and their opportunities, and this little chart that was put together by this commentary kind of allows us to see where all of those come from. So if you had absolutely nothing to do, you could go and look at this if you wanted to. It was really interesting.
I love it.
Yes, it is good.
I like the way he says, this is what the Lord says.
Yeah.
This is what the Lord says.
Thus saith the Lord.
Thus saith the Lord.
Yeah.
And he keeps repeating it. This is
Yeah.
what the Lord says. Not what you see that.
Yeah, because Amos didn't have a lot to say on his own, because he had not asked for any of this.
The
Yeah,
Lord
when we
took
die, we go to heaven. You know, somebody said you can beat anybody. I don't know why I'm stuck on Elijah.
Elijah?
How he was such an upright man, God just took him. Elijah was more.
Yeah.
That is like, I'm fixated on that for some reason. I know that'll never be me, but
Well, it hadn't been anybody since Elijah that I know of. Had Enoch before him. Yeah, you kind of got to wonder what God was up to there.
you do, and it just cuts off after that, and there's nothing.
Well, you know, that's kind of how he appears on the scene. You get into it, and all of a sudden there's Elijah talking.
Yeah.
And you go, where did he come from? And he changes the course of the whole story in what he's doing. Yeah. Okay. So this anyway, I thought you might like having an outline of this, so that because we are gonna kind of hop and skip around, and then this really got my attention. Seeing how so much of what he is saying relates right back to what God has already said. So it truly is when he's saying, you know, thus says the Lord, that he did already say it. And it's written down somewhere.
And you see Amos, he was such a country boy. I mean, it's like God
He uses everybody.
because he had so many different hats he wore. You know, he just looked like he was a guy trying to make a living
Yeah.
in his day, and you know, having multiple tasks, multiple jobs,
And still had his
and
ears
still
tuned to
he was
God.
Ears tuned to God, and God said, "Do this."
Yeah, and he did it.
went. He was faithful.
Yeah. Yeah. Almost the opposite encounter we have with Moses, where we don't have the narrative between Amos and God in this, but we do with Moses, and he kept trying to find any means under the sun to get out of what God was asking him to do, and he always had an answer there too, wasn't he?
And Hosea is the same. I mean, he's the same type of.
Yeah, Hosea didn't ask for it.
No, and,
Yeah.
and he's just a guy trying to,
Yeah, trying to.
get through life.
Yeah. The words of Amos, who was one of the sheep breeders from Tekoa. What he saw regarding Israel in the days of King Uzziah of Judah and Jeroboam son of Jehoash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. The earthquake's recorded extra biblically, so we know that happened. And all of this that's a 30-year span from Uzziah in the south to the end of Jeroboam, whose reign was in the north. And this earthquake kind of lines up with kind of the tail end of Jeroboam's. So he could have prophesied over the whole amount of time, but we have here a specific time with the earthquake. So maybe the last 7-10 years that Jeroboam is king is when this really began to come forth and be heard or remembered anyway. So he said, the Lord roars from Zion and makes his voice heard from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn and the summit of Carmel withers. So in Micah, God steps out of heaven and he steps on the mountains and they melt away, because here he comes, he's angry and he doesn't, he's going to deal with this problem. And so here's a different vision of God coming where it's bringing, mourning and shivering, withering away, just vanishing nearly. The Lord says, I will not relent from punishing Damascus. Okay, look at we want to look at because we don't know where all these places are, right? Anybody know what he's talking about when he says Damascus? He's saying Aram. But who's Aram? Aram was Syria. Okay, so this is I will not relent from punishing Syria. Syria is when we look back in 2 Kings around chapters 7, 8, 9, somewhere in there is when all this is happening, and so it's referred to Syria then, and Aram is used not as the primary. Damascus was the capital city of Syria, and so when you hear about Samaria being the northern kingdom, that's because there was a town called Samaria, and it was the capital most of the time that it was a nation.
It's the same Damascus that Paul was headed to.
That same one. Yep. I will not relent from punishing Damascus for 3 crimes, even 4, meaning for all their crimes. So 3 was a complete number. You went beyond complete. That means it included everything. Because they threshed Gilead with iron sledges, and this is what they did. They went in to that portion of Judah and just decimated it. There wasn't a thing left. Okay. He says, therefore I will send fire against Hazael's palace, and it will consume Ben-Hadad's citadels. I will break down the gates of Damascus. I will cut off the ruler from the valley of Avon, and the one who wields the scepter from Beth Eden. The people of Aram will be exiled to Kir. The Lord has spoken. And this is exactly what happened. The Assyrians came in first and hauled all those people off. So what is he saying here? I will send fire. This is holy fire. This is judgmental fire. So when you read fire in most prophetic work, it's talking about whatever God has decided to do to bring destruction. In this case, it was literally fire. It was burned down. He says, I will break down the gates. Damascus was ransacked by the Assyrians. I will cut off the ruler from the valley of Avon. That was the exit route. That was the trade route out of town, and they weren't going to allow anybody to leave. And then he goes on that they will be exiled. He says the Lord has spoken. Nothing's going to change what the Lord. So you see this at the beginning. This is a great illustration here. It goes all the way through. The Lord says and the Lord has spoken. He says it again. The Lord says and the Lord has spoken. Like bookends at the end of this. It's an all-inclusive statement, and you're not going to change it because God's word is at the beginning and the end of it. Try all you want, but that's how it's going to be. Then he goes on and says he's going to punish Gaza. All right, everybody knows where Gaza is today? Between Egypt and Israel is Gaza. And then above
Where they keep up
where the Gaza
like
Strip. Yeah, they fall over it forever. In fact, Carter and Menachem Begum, they were the one that agreed to allow the Philistines to have, or the Palestinians, not the Philistines. Gaza actually is the Philistines in this. They allowed the Palestinians to have Gaza, and then also established the West Bank. Okay, so Israel was kind of sandwiched in between the Palestinians, and it was been a problem ever since. But this, I will not relent from punishing Gaza, and this is the Philistines. All right, so the giant people, they were people of just uncommon stature.
People that
Yeah.
was in Israel before Ammonites, right?
Yes.
Ammonites?
Yep. And to give a little bit of background, they were believed to be descendants from the Phoenicians, actually, which were from the Macedonian area. So you're talking about Europeans at that point that were Philistines that had come over. And so you take a guy that's an average height of 5'6", 5'7", and you bring in some guys from Europe that are 6'4", 6'5", and they're giants. Yeah.
Well,
So-
David slew the Philistine giant.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what they were.
So there were no actual giants.
Well, not the way we think about giants. We think of Jack and the Beanstalk is when we think about a giant. Yeah. Yeah.
Try to keep up with my son, who's totally gone.
But I'm gonna tell you, I'm 6'5" is tall. I have 2 regular members at the store, and they're women. And they're 6'5".
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, they find archaeological evidence all the time in that area of people that were 6'8" and over. I mean, not just a few, a lot. So it was so the people from that area of Europe have shrunk too. They're not near as tall as they used to be. So it just happens over time, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, in England, if you want to go into some pubs, you have to duck.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
because the
you're
doors are
taller
so.
than the doorway.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and that's in a lot of places.
Yeah,
Because they used,
People are
they
little.
used
People
to
got-
be, no,
people
they
got
used to
taller.
be really short. Now that instead if
Now
you
they're
go
taller.
somewhere, you've got a duck.
So he says, I will not relent from punishing Gaza for 3 crimes, even 4, because they exiled a whole community. All right, they were part of, I forget who's exiled at the moment, but they basically took a town into slavery and sold them to Edom. Okay? Edom has always been a problem. And they're actually related to the Israelites. The Edomites come from Esau. Okay, so Esau and Jacob shared the same circumcision, and but they were always a problem. They just never got along. After that one encounter at the Jabbok River, when everything was happy between Jacob and Esau, and that was kind of the last time. So he says, they exiled the whole community, handed them over to Edom. Edom, therefore, I will send fire against the walls of Gaza, and I will consume its citadels. I will cut them off from Ashdod. They were kind of a vassal state to the Syrians, and I'm not going to allow for that anymore. The one who yields the scepter from Ashkelon, and I will also turn my hand against Ekron, which is a city, and the remainder of the Philistines will perish. The Lord God has spoken. So what he's saying is they're going to be overrun by the Assyrians, and they were. And when that happened, that opened the door for the Assyrians to enter the southern kingdom, which is what this is all being prophesied about, the southern kingdom and also the northern kingdom. So he does the same thing with Tyre. Tyre was a all these kingdoms were like city kingdoms, like city states. So you've heard of Tyre and Sidon in the New Testament. Tyre was kind of a subservient to Sidon. So it wasn't a very strong city state. But what they had done says, I will not relent from punishing Tyre for 3 crimes, even 4, because they handed over a whole community of exiles to who else? Edom, the slave traders of the day. All right? And broke a treaty of brotherhood, which is what he's saying here, is that there should never have been a problem between Edom and the Israelites. They're brothers. But that's been broken. Therefore, I will send fire against the walls of Tyre and will consume its citadels.
Can we revert their treaty?
Yeah. Yeah. And there was a treaty there actually was a treaty that existed between Edom that had been established a while back after the divided kingdom, and they broke it. So you kind of see where that is. See where Edom is on the map there, and Moab, okay, and Philistia. So he's talking about everything that's to the north of Judah, but the purple part of that map, let's see, is the northern kingdom. And so what he's basically, all those people had surrounded the north, and to the south of that is Judah, and so they were. God had kind of moved all the chess pieces into place so that when he got ready to do this, it was going to be no problem for him to do it. So he says, I will not relent from punishing Edom for 3 crimes, even 4, because he pursued his brother with the sword. Same story again, see? So Israel's been, and Judah have been constantly pursued by all these other nations. And why? Because long ago God said, I've removed my hand from you because of all this idol worship that you're performing. And they still didn't learn their lesson, so now they got to learn another lesson. He stifled his compassion, his anger tore at him continually, and he harbored his rage incessantly. This is Edom. Therefore I will send fire against Timon, that was the capital city, and will consume the citadels of Basra. So that was a fortress town that kind of kept at bay. The one trade route that came through the nation was protected by Basra, and it was going to fall too. Same thing with the Ammonites. You can look on the map there. The Ammonites are, they would be, you see where it is up there? It says Ammon. That's where they were. I'm going to punish them too because they ripped open the pregnant women of Gilead. This actually happened.
Good Lord.
Let me see if it'll show me the... 2 Kings 8, 12 describes that, as does 15, 16. So yeah, this is something that they did. And they did it just so they could gain territory. Territory that God had already given to his people, but they'd already lost to somebody else. Therefore I will set fire to the walls of Rabbah, and I will consume its citadels. They will be shouting on the day of battle, and a violent wind on the day of a storm. Their kings and princesses will go into exile together. The Lord has spoken. And then the same thing with Moab. Moab's in between the Ammonites and the Edomites. I will not relent from punishing Moab, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom to lime. So this is what they did, and this is recorded extra biblically too. When they went in and took Edom, they dug up the bones of their ancestors and burned them.
Oh no.
Okay, as a way of saying, if you worship your ancestors, you might as well forget about it. We just burned them to nothing.
They destroyed their history.
Yeah, that's right.
It's
Wipe 'em out.
sociopathic, isn't it?
Yeah,
That would be like somebody coming and burning your photographs,
right.
your family album, or whatever.
Yeah, just take them out, man.
And tear down statues.
Yeah, and tearing down statues. That's right. Therefore, I will send fire against Moab, and I will consume the citadels of Kerath. Moab will die with a tumult, with shouting and the sound of the ram's horn. I will cut off the judge from the land, meaning the king, and kill all its officials with him. And the Lord has spoken. So nobody gets off here.
What is a tumult?
Tumult, total chaos.
Yeah.
Total anarchy. Everything's there's no degree of order left. It's just going to be run, every man for himself, run for your lives type thing. Yeah.
And is Tyre the proper pronunciation for that, or because
What?
I've heard it called Tyree?
Oh, well, I'm pretty sure it's Tyre.
I'm just asking.
Yeah.
'Cause
Yeah. No, I'm pretty sure it's Tyre.
T-Y-R-E, Tyra. Like
Yeah.
you said.
Yeah. I'm just going by what I remember in the Greek.
That's what
Because it-
that's what
It's Marta. I don't know how to pronounce it.
It's yeah. It's
That's
it's a
fine.
single
Yeah,
syllable.
Just spell Taurus.
I've heard it called
Both
both
ways.
ways, and I wasn't sure.
Okay, so finally in the rest of 2 here, and then next week we won't do this way. We're going to take just particular passages. But I wanted to go through because it sets the stage. God declares what he's going to do, and then he holds court and explains why. And it's all because, like the last 2 sheets show, it's like Amos is going through very systematically and saying, this is what's wrong. You broke Deuteronomy chapter,
They went through history.
it goes through, all the way
These
through.
are the charges against you.
Yeah, these are the charges, and this is why. You can't escape it. But it'll take us a while if we go through all of them. It's a lot. It says, I will not relent from punishing Judah. So this is supposed to be the good kids on the block, Judah, for 3 crimes, even 4, because they have rejected the instruction of the Lord. What is he talking about?
The law.
The law. Okay. They claim to be the keepers of the law, and they had broken it. And here's Amos. Oh, Amos, he goes up and down, and he's telling them, you've broke the law and have not kept his statutes. The lies that their ancestors followed have led them astray. So what he's saying here, you not only broke the law, you created a new law based on what your forefathers had to say about it. And when you start thinking about who those were, Ahab, and I could go through the whole list, but you know they didn't have a very good grasp on anything that was godly. So he says, you've rejected all that and have not kept his statutes. The lies that your ancestors followed, they led us. Therefore, I will send fire against Judah and will consume the citadels of Jerusalem. Now notice, it says, the Lord says, but it doesn't say, thus saith the Lord at the end of that.
What is the timeline on all of that? Because some of that stuff that they talk about, their sins, what happened when, maybe when some of these people were not alive, or did it?
Well, what
What
he's referring back
Going
to,
back to history.
Yes.
Yes, so I'm just saying, these people that wasn't a part of it may suffer for it.
that's exactly right.
Exactly.
So when God says that your sins will be delivered upon your children to the third and fourth generation, yeah.
And every
So he's
generation
yeah.
messing up, so.
And this is not only just the results of our own living. At some point, God is saying, "I've got to deal with this," and it's going to be your
You should have
children.
dealt with it then.
Well, yeah, you would wish.
God, what are you doing?
Yeah, but it's kind of a reality. Yeah, and this is really it is remarkable how we pass along what John Bradshaw called the poisonous pedagogy of our family secrets. We would keep secrets, and that would begin to shape how the family life would be held together, and so for the same thing, it was the poison of their idol worship and their multiple marriage and all those things just brought it brings down the standard just ever so until finally something's got to be done or you're going to die. I mean, you just die in that. And so God says, I'll deal with it. Why he does it the way he does it, why he waits, I've always wondered why he waits. Why not just snack in the teeth right now and get it over with? But he doesn't.
Well, who knows? They may have suffered consequences
Well-
for bad choices back then.
You
Well,
know,
they
like
did.
he
All the way
was-
through history, you find it. Even the good kings, like Asa, was a good king up until the point he got sick, and he calls on doctors rather than God. And he gets mad because the doctors can't heal him, and he's bitter toward God because he's got the disease in the first place. And so how does that happen after such a long, good life with God? It's just like it says to us, it's just in us that we just want things to be our way when we want it. That was Adam and Eve's problem, and that's been a lot of the problem. So God's timing in dealing with those things, they all had to suffer, but then the children did too. And in fact, in the histories, it says, so and so became king, and he did just like whatever king was before him.
He didn't learn a thing.
Yeah, and had every opportunity to.
Yeah.
And some of them did learn, and then they still went back. And then Ahab, crazy man, he was so bad. And then after Jezebel died, he kind of got good.
'Cause she was so.
Yeah.
She was an
She was the original influencer.
But you don't think he was just giving us a chance to keep showing that mercy until we just bury ourselves?
Well, I do think that
Because every time something comes good out of it, there's always somebody
when
that
God
saves us.
when God shows Himself, then we know that the next thing we do is gonna be shaped by that. Either we're going to respond to it positively, or we're going to ignore it, or we're going to respond negatively to it. So, as an example of that is the Assyrians are going to come against Ahab, and the prophet comes to him. We assume it's Elisha, but it never says, and says that the Lord is going to defeat this army for you, just so He can prove to you and show you that He is your Lord, that He's your God. And that statement is made twice to him. They have one battle. The spring comes on, and they say, "Oh, the reason why they beat us is because their God's a God of the hills and not the God of the plains. So we'll fight them in the plains next time, and God won't be able to fight there. And God says, I'm going to go show you. He doesn't ever address what the battle's about at all. He just says, I'm going to show you that I'm your God. Well, then in the end, Ahab still makes a deal with King Ben-Hadad and saves his life. And God says, I handed him to you twice. And you're just not listening to anything I have to say. Anyway, I don't know what that has to do with this, but he does make it. When he finally does act and speak, then our next move should be one of moving toward him, because he's shown himself to who I am. But so often we're shown that that's not what happens. We still do what we want to do. And the same thing happens today. Jesus has utterly shown us the full measure of God in every sense of the word, and we are left with what we're going to do with that. So is it going to be loyal love for him, for what he's done, or are we just going to do what we want to do? Love ourselves, in an improper way. And that's what usually happens. And in today's world, however you want to express that is allowed. Your love for yourself, which is a wacky way to live, man. And it's showing up everywhere now.
Historically, there's always been consequences for our actions. And to even consider that that's not going to happen is being in denial.
Yeah, that's reinventing God, yeah. When we look at everything that he's proven, and not just in biblical history, we can see it in our own history. If you really want to look, if just read about the Battle of Gettysburg and begin to decide if God wanted the South to win or the North to win that battle, and you will see immediately that some things happened that should have never happened, that turned the tide of that battle away from the South to the North. Okay? So you can talk about the North and the South all you want. When you start looking, things happen that shouldn't have happened. How did that happen? And I just think it's God working.
What was God? He wanted the North to win.
Yeah.
Otherwise the South would have won.
That's what. On hindsight.
Actually,
Or D-Day, another one.
everything pointed towards the South. When in the South, that
They should have won
they were
Gettysburg.
better fighters. They hid behind trees and shot you.
Yeah.
Okay, where the Yankees came down and they were standing in open fields.
Yeah, they fought like the British.
Yeah.
And their red coats. I always thought that was silly, wearing those red coats.
All right, we got one section here left, and then I didn't want to get off on that, but I was making an illustration. So Israel, I will not relent from punishing Israel for 3 crimes, even 4, because they sell a righteous person for silver and a needy person for a pair of sandals. Repeating what we've heard from Micah, only he does a much better, more colorful job in describing this. They trample the heads of the poor on the dust of the ground and obstruct the path of the needy. So until we get to that last line, this is what's happening when Jeroboam is king. The Assyrians are being threatened by the Persians, and so they've had to turn all their attention to the north. Egypt is just about whipped. They're not worth anything. We find out in Jeremiah that the southern kingdom turns to Egypt for help, and God gets all over them for doing that because they're just weaklings. There's nothing to them. So for a period of years there, they had a lot of peace, and they developed a lot of wealth. And the rich were using that wealth to do some terrible things, mainly put down the poor. And this reference to a man and his father having sexual relations with the same girl, what they're talking about here is buying prostitute and sharing a prostitute.
Yeah.
Okay? So he's illustrating for us the depths of, they've got all of this money because they're becoming wealthy, and this is what they're doing with it. They're oppressing the poor, and they're using it to satisfy their own sexual gratifications. And so here we are, same song, umpteenth verse. which all of it is profaning the holy name of God. These are my people. They wear my name, and they're doing these things. So not unlike Christianity today, and everything that's happened with the SBC just in the last 2 weeks, and you begin to think they've profaned the holy name of God because we wear His name, and allowed all these terrible things to happen and covered up.
It's just like Catholics. It's just like Catholics.
Yeah.
They protected the priests for a long, long time.
It says they stretch out beside every altar, our garments, on garments taken as collateral, stretching out. Another polite way of saying that they're having relations with a pagan like a temple prostitute, stretching out, and they're doing it on a garment that they've stolen really from a poor person. They've taken as collateral for a loan or something, because that was the most valuable thing you had, was your outer garment.
My Bible says taken in pledge. Garments taken in pledge.
In a pledge, yeah. So if a poor person needed, $5 to take care of their family for the week, then they would say, okay, well, give me your cloak, your outer garment, and that was really the most valuable thing you had. Like pawning it, yeah. And in the house of their God, they drink wine obtained through fines. So this house of their God means Yahweh God, but he's saying in that they would the wine that they would bring as an offering was wine that they collected as a fine against someone that had owed them money or done them wrong in some sort of way. So it wasn't an offering of wine that had come from their own. It was something that they'd taken from somebody else in some sort of way. Yet I destroyed the Amorite. He's reminded them as Israel advanced. This was in the desert. His height was like cedars, and he was sturdy as oaks. I destroyed his fruit from above and his roots beneath. So he's reminding them, you've turned your back on the one that has cared for you from the very beginning. He says, and I brought you from the land of Egypt and led you 40 years in the wilderness in order to possess the land of the Amorite. So he's got the second event ahead of the first. I brought you out of Egypt. We met the Amorites. I defeated the Amorites for you. All right? Or else you would have never gotten to where you've gotten. I raised up some of your sons as prophets and some of your young men as Nazarites. The two greatest privileges. The priesthood was promised to a tribe. The Levites was promised to a tribe. Okay? But to be a Nazarite or a prophet meant that God had chosen you for that, had communicated that to your family. Okay? They responded to that. So relationship was occurring and God's will was being done. He says, I raised up these. Is this not the case? He says, this is the Lord's declaration. I've done all these things. He says, but you made the Nazarite drink wine. So you corrupted what I set aside and commanded the prophets, do not prophesy. And we see that a lot in Jeremiah and others. So I set them aside to prophesy, and you basically said, don't do it. I don't want to hear what you have to say. So I told them to tell you what I was saying, and you told them to shut my mouth. This is the way that God was viewing this. You've put a muzzle on me because you've told the prophets to shut up. Remember Jesus said, oh, you killed the prophets. What he's talking about. Okay. Look, I'm about to crush you in your place as a wagon crushes when full of grain. Escape will fail the swift. You won't be able to get away. The strong one will not maintain his strength, and the warrior will not save his life. The archer will not stand his ground. The one who is swift of foot will not save himself. He's repeating himself here to make sure you understand. And the one riding the horse will not save his life. There's no speed, there's no weapon, there's no skill that is going to ever bring you out of what I'm preparing for you. Even the most
Run away from God.
yeah, you can't run. Even the most courageous of the warriors will flee naked on that day. This is the Lord's declaration. So you may have taken another's cloak as collateral and used it in these profane ways, but there's going to be a day when you're going to leave not only your cloak behind, but everything you've got.
Yeah.
You're going to want to flee this place. So when we look at the two in comparison, the northern kingdom gets a lot more of God's wrath, it seems, than the southern kingdom does. But they've been at this longer. We have to remember, ever since Jeroboam, son of Nebat, had rebelled against Rehoboam, they went into this idol worship and disobeying God full force. The southern kingdom followed many years later. They really fell into full-blown corruption, and so it's, that's how most people read the disparage and how much is being declared. So next week we will look. We'll probably spend most of our time I don't know how we'll do it yet. The main things that I want us to look at, and the next one is verses 9 and 10 and 11 are significant to that first section, 6 through 11, and the second one. So we'll just pick out the most important passages and try to move through, so we're not bogged down in it for too long. And we might want to do it all. They're not long. They're 15 verses. It's 12 to 15 verses, but won't take a lot.
So, Brother Mark, I want to say that talking about how it was then, I look at today's world, and you remember I told you about the lady at church that goes to people's homes and they study